When you think of disaster management, economic development, urban planning, community resilience, a name that needs to be on the top of your list is Dr. Maria Watson, who is an assistant professor engaged in all of those topics in her research and teaching. We were so pleased to welcome Dr. Watson to the faculty. Her academic home is in the Rinker School of Construction Management, and she's an affiliated researcher with the Schimberg Center for Housing Studies. So prior to joining our faculty in Gainesville, she was in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Urban Planning at Texas A&M, also was involved in part of the Hazard Reduction Recovery Center. And her background is she holds and has earned degrees in urban planning from the Ohio State and Texas A&M University. So Dr. Watson's research does focus on factors that impact community recovery after disaster events. Particularly, she's quite interested in exploring the interdependencies between infrastructure, housing, and businesses, and also gauging the effectiveness of disaster programs and how disaster programs can be structured to better meet recovery needs. Interestingly, Dr. Watson has been part of multiple interdisciplinary disaster recovery research efforts in Texas, Louisiana, and North Carolina, namely after Hurricane Ike, Harvey, Matthew, Florence, Laura, and Delta. Welcome to Florida too. I think we'll probably you'll experience some disaster relief here, in the foreseeable future. Notably, she has been funded by the National Science Foundation, NSF, and I believe actually has submitted a grant this fall to NSF as well. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, FEMA, to name a few sponsors for her research. She has taught courses in quantitative methods, local government and urban planning, and has started expanding her teaching portfolio here at UF, co-teaching a course on principles of sustainable development and construction. Let me welcome Dr. Maria Watson. We're looking forward to hearing more in depth about your research, and I would welcome those in attendance. If you want to pop a question into the chat, we will block some time at the end of our session for questions, or if you just want to unmute and ask her questions at the end, that's fine too. Okay, let's go ahead. Welcome, Dr. Watson.
Thank you so much. Let me try to share my screen here. Can you all see that? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so excited to be here. I know there's a lot going on in the college. We were just talking about all the searches going on, so I appreciate you spending the time to be here at this hour. And I know maybe some folks will join late due to some of these other things. So yeah, I'm just gonna dive right in. Today I'm gonna be talking about some of my work looking at disaster assistance, especially after Hurricane Ike, and kind of how we think about how effective these programs are, and yeah, sorry, I'm looking at the chat. Yeah, how effective these programs are, and how we can hopefully make them better in the future. Okay, so I put this slide in the front just to kind of introduce why I'm talking about this today. So I really started becoming interested in disaster assistance even before I knew I wanted to have a PhD or get my PhD. This was when I was in my master's program at Texas A&M, and I started exploring doing research with my advisor and deciding whether I wanted to do a thesis, like maybe some of the students here in this call. So I started kind of talking to people in Galveston about their experience after Hurricane Ike, and these were some of the comments that I got from them back in 2013. And so that was about 5 years after Hurricane Ike had occurred. And so as you can see, pretty negative, a lot of negative opinions about disaster assistance, especially so long since the event had occurred. And so I really, I ended up doing my master's thesis in Galveston, looking at actually business assistance in that case. And then just kind of started going deeper and deeper, and I got my PhD doing this. And yeah, so today I want to take a pretty high level discussion about some of these questions about disaster assistance and the effectiveness of disaster assistance, just to kind of share what I've learned so far since then. And so I'm kind of breaking a cardinal rule of talks in that I'm going to be showing a lot of models, but I hope you guys will forgive me. It's a small enough group that, if you guys want to ask questions as it comes up, I think that's totally fine. Put it in the chat, or you can unmute, especially because I'm only going to be kind of lightly talking about each of these just to kind of give a sense broadly about some of these topics. So please feel free to jump in anytime. I would be happy to chat. Okay. So thinking about broadly the effectiveness of disaster assistance, we can kind of come at it in 3 different angles. And so that's kind of how I've structured some of the research that I'm going to talk about today. So first, we can ask who gets assistance, so who's actually benefiting from some of these programs. We can also ask maybe the more obvious question, which is, does disaster assistance actually help in recovery? Does it lead to better recovery outcomes? And then third, kind of more of a forward-thinking question of how do we structure disaster assistance to make us more prepared for a future event? So is disaster assistance allowing homes and businesses to adapt? Are they allowing them to move, be more sustainable, use more sustainable methods? So kind of looking into the future in terms of how assistance is setting us up to be more resilient in the future. So I'm going to kind of go through these. And a lot of what I'm talking about is a lot of different research efforts. And so I want to just take a moment to thank some of the other collaborators that are working with me on some of these. So Dr. Hamadeh at Stony Brook University, Dr. Peacock at Texas A&M, Dr. Gu at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, Justin Henry at the Galveston Historical Foundation, and Dr. Thornton, who's also at Texas A&M. So just a quick thanks to those amazing people. So I'm going to start with a little background on Hurricane Ike and the SBA Disaster Loan Program, which is what I'm going to primarily focus on. So I'm mostly going to be talking about the SBA Disaster Loan Program. There are a couple different types of disaster assistance. SBA is the largest, and I think surprisingly little people actually do research on SBA, even though it is so large. Usually when we talk about disaster assistance or we think about disaster assistance, we think about FEMA, maybe we think about housing and urban development and some of the CDBG funds. But SBA is a really large program, and how it differentiates from something like FEMA or something like CDBG is it's actually loan-based. They are low interest loans. So for homes and businesses, it might be between 3% and 5% interest rate. And so it does behave a little bit differently, but it does allow for quite a large pool of money because that money does end up coming back into the larger pot of resources. And so this is kind of how SBA funding tends to get dispersed and distributed. So, once a disaster occurs, the president has to declare a disaster, and then that money is appropriated. Homeowners and businesses, once that happens, can then apply directly to the SBA for loans. It's not a supplemental funding where Congress has to go through and approve new legislation. It's actually annually appropriated every year. So SBA always has this pot of money. And so, it's generally pretty fast here, but yeah, so the homeowners and businesses apply for the loans. The SBA then accepts the applications and it's then on their end to then approve it. And so I have some of these bolded because these are some of the points in time that I'm going to be looking at in some of these analyses. So, how long does it take between, bullet point number 3 and bullet point number 4? And how is the SBA making that decision in that bullet point? And then, so this is another thing that doesn't get looked at too frequently, which is you can be approved for disaster assistance, but you don't necessarily have to accept it. Sometimes if given that it is a loan, maybe the loan terms are more unfavorable, or you don't think you can accept additional debt at that time. That's something that I think becomes more of an issue for small businesses. But if you have, maybe a longer mortgage or maybe 2 mortgages, it might be an issue. So there is, this kind of secondary decision-making process that happens once the approval has started, and that's whether they use the funding. And so, once all parties agree, the loans are dispersed, and then they can use that money towards recovery. So I kind of put this up here. It's a little bit out there, I guess, but this is sort of the theory too that I'm using to think about the behavior of both the SBA, so how they're deciding what the program is going to look like, as well as how businesses and homes and other organizations are going to be deciding what to do. So institutional logics, don't really need to know what that is, but it's a theory of organizational behavior. It's in sociology. And so you can use ideal type analysis and try to understand really these underlying mechanisms that are determining organizational behavior. So, for example, based on the geographic distance, which I have highlighted here, might affect whether it's a loan versus a grant, because if you have a more global or even national geographic distance, you have more resources to draw from. And, there's some time piece here at the bottom there. So, for an organization like SBA or a federal organization, time is a really important piece because it's sort of how they determine who's eligible for the loans, but it also kind of serves as the accountability piece to the taxpayer, makes it seem, that they're doing a good job. And so you can kind of start looking at these different pieces of how people kind of organize their behaviors in these different ways. But like I said, it's just sort of broadly trying to understand, why loans get used, why it's as fast or slow as it is, and who approves these types of things. Okay. So the case that I'm going to be talking about today is Galveston County after Hurricane Ike. And so Galveston County is, I guess it's over here, is this county down here, highlighted in red. It's southeast of Houston. It's a barrier island similar to what we see in Florida. And then Hurricane Ike was a hurricane that came through back in 2008. It's been some time, but it's taken me a long time. So this is the track of Hurricane Ike. So it went through. This is the island of Galveston. This is the Bolivar Peninsula, which is another piece of Galveston County. The whole county is kind of this area here. Storm surge levels on the island reached up to 10 feet. It was very devastating to homes and businesses in the area. It was a pretty severe storm and affected a lot of people. So we're going to be looking at that. And then in terms of what assistance came in, how the SBA Loan Program was used after Hurricane Ike. So I just kind of have some statistics of the home loans and the business loans that came out after Hurricane Ike. So this is a map of all the different loans that were approved after Ike. And so the larger ones mean that, there's a higher concentration. So you can see kind of remembering that surge map that some of these more affected properties were here in this is kind of the downtown area. And then now we're getting a little bit south of Houston up here. So there were around 2,000 home loans approved, 6,000 were declined, which yields about a 28% approval rate of people that were looking for assistance from the SBA after Hurricane Ike. In terms of business loans, it was a little bit higher at 33% approval rate. 521 loans were approved, whereas 1,000 were declined. And I have an asterisk there because, interestingly, a lot of the business loans ended up going to rental property. And so Galveston, like a lot of other kind of tourist areas or, have economies based on tourism, there's a lot of seasonal housing, a lot of rental properties. And so a lot of those business loans ended up going towards some of those vacation type or rental housing. So not too many businesses. And so if you think of like just on the island here, there's about, in the parcel, there's about 24,000 parcels. So maybe like 20,000 homes. For businesses, I think it's like 18,000 across the whole county. So it's actually a kind of small percentage of people that ended up actually getting assistance after Hurricane Ike. And then in terms of, all right, how much did people end up getting when they got their loans, either from businesses or homes? So the average home loan was around $64,000. The average business loan was around $171,000. So much larger for business loans, but you can kind of see there was a lot more variation for the business nonprofits than the homes. The homes were a little bit more condensed. You can see that, especially for the business loans, the maximum amount you could get is around 2 million. And so you did get quite high levels of amounts, but on average, it was about 64,000 and 171,000. And then in terms of timing, how quick was assistance able to get in after Galveston and Hurricane Ike? So it took around 2 months or so for homes to actually get the completed application into SBA. And then it took more around 3 months for the application to be completed from businesses. So that time from Hurricane Ike to when SBA says, okay, this is a complete application and we can start reviewing it. Once SBA received the application from homes and businesses, it took not very long for it to end up being approved. Another, let's say, two weeks or so for homes, maybe a little bit longer between the completed and the approved application for businesses, maybe another month or 3 weeks or so. In terms of when the money actually ended up getting dispersed, so that difference between when the money is actually approved for the home or the business and then when it actually is in their hand and they can start using it for recovery processes and start rebuilding their home or business. That didn't occur until around 4 or 5 months for homes and about 6 months for businesses. So some of the research that I'm going to be talking about with respect to these loans for homes and businesses use a variety of different data. So of course, the SBA data that I just showed, which was given to me through a Freedom of Information Act request, which is sort of the mechanism that we can use to get government data. And the SBA is really wonderful and open with their data. So they are very, very willing to share. So that, and then for the business analyses, I had to include a couple of business databases. I use a lot of administrative data, so tax assessor data, parcel data, stuff that's usually collected at the municipal level, permitting data. So, how were people applying for permits, sale and franchise tax data, as well as some primary data. So I did some in-person observations. I've done surveys in Galveston. And then I also used, in terms of replicating Hurricane Ike and the intensity and the flooding, I used some AdCirc models, which are kind of like just like the surge and the wave height models from, I got these from Brett Webb, who's at the University of South Alabama. So thanks also to him for that. And again, for people that have just joined, I'm going to be just doing a very broad overview of some of the analyses that I've done, because I really want to just talk about some of these issues with disaster assistance more broadly. So, I'm just going to kind of briefly mention the methods here, especially for students in the audience that maybe aren't so interested in the statistics piece. But some of these will be, so just general multiple linear regression. So if it's, a continuous variable, if it's days or the amount of funding, for example. Logistic regression, looking at whether or not homes and businesses decide to take the loan. And then for one part of the analysis, I did what's considered a matching technique or quasi-experimental design, where you kind of think of this more in more medical-based studies, but you try to have one either person or business that has, had something occur. In medicine, of course, it's a treatment, whether they get a shot, whether they get a new type of medicine. And then you try to have a control group, right, where it's very similar to the treatment group, but the only difference being that one received the new treatment or the medicine and one didn't. And so in this case, I'm going to be trying to create that experimental design after the fact with who gets loans and who didn't get loans, and trying to compare those two groups. So that's what these two kind of bottom ones are. And so I used a matching technique called force and exact matching. You don't really need to know what that is, but it's just a way to actually pair that treatment and control group together. Okay, so let's start with our first question on what makes disaster assistance effective. And so, of course, we're interested in who gets disaster assistance, especially because we know that disaster assistance or disasters in general can be very differential depending on which area it is. There can be differences in recovery based on income, based on race. So it's really important to see how disaster assistance plays into that process and either makes up for some of these differences in recovery, or maybe exacerbates some of these differences in recovery. So we're just going to start with looking at who gets these assistance. And so, as I mentioned, the SBA Loan Program is a loan. And so looking at some of the denial and approval statistics, I didn't get, unfortunately, data on the individual applications, only the ones that were approved. So the only way that we can really look at some of this denial and approval type of information is through these summary statistics that the SBA gave me. And so you can see these are the decision code. So every time an application comes in, there has to be a decision code on why that application was not approved, if it was not approved. And so this is a summary of the types of denials or the reasons behind some of the denials for these programs. And so you can see that a lot of it is financial based. And so these two kind of highlighted ones are either the SBA didn't see a repayment ability for the loan, and so they were denied the loan for that reason, or there was unsatisfactory credit, which is of course related to repayment ability. So even though we would like to think that disaster assistance is based on damage and is based on need, at least in the case of the SBA Loan Program, it's really, in this case, what we're seeing here, seem to be pretty based on repayment ability and the ability for the home or the business to take on that additional debt. Okay, so moving on from just the approval, so who gets denied the loans. Now we're just looking at the subset of homes and businesses that did get approved for funding and looking at within that group who got more money. So if we're interested in that question of does damage lead to more assistance or does repayment ability lead to more assistance, we can kind of explore it a little bit more, looking at these loan amounts, controlling for these other factors. And so this is looking at business loan approvals. And so looking at, this is, well, I logged the approved amount, but looking at, so the ability of damage, business characteristics, area characteristics, based on the census block group, for those of you that are familiar with census data. And then some of the assistance characteristics in determining how much money businesses get. And so, if you're not too familiar with statistics, it just means that each of these variables has an effect controlling for those other variables. So, the effect of the damage controlling for, the property amount, for example, because, if 1 inch of flooding is in a bigger house, it's going to cause more damage than 1 inch of flooding in a smaller house. But we can kind of just tease out just the effect of the flooding itself rather than the flooding and the property amount, if that makes sense. So in this case, we see that I can just summarize it for you that so businesses with more damage, larger businesses, older businesses, and corporations were the ones that ended up being approved for more money. Home-based businesses, if they're operating out of the home, were approved for less money. If the business is in a denser area or a higher income area, they were also approved for less money. And that could be because they have other recovered resources such as insurance, or maybe they receive some other type of funding. And then in terms of the actual characteristic of the assistance itself, businesses with longer loan terms, longer application times, and longer loan deliberation times were approved for more money. When we look at it from the home side, so how much money did households get and how did they differ? We kind of see maybe some similar trends in terms of, more of these repayment ability factors. So of course, homes with higher damage were approved for more money. It is an assistance program. Higher value homes were approved for more money. And this is why it's important that we know that these types of statistics control for these other factors, because the higher value homes were approved for more money even when controlling for damage. Older homes were approved for more money, or occupied homes were approved for more money. The income variable was insignificant, but of course, neighborhood income is very correlated with individual household values, just because they tend to cluster and the way that our zoning is. And we do see some racial disparities too when controlling for income, value, and damage. So for homes that were in Block groups with higher percent Hispanic populations or higher percent of non-Hispanic Black populations, they were on average approved for less money. So the next is looking at that decision process of, okay, so now I'm approved for a loan, do I take it? And so for homes and businesses, I mentioned this before, this could be based on whether or not they feel like they can actually take on this additional debt. And so for businesses, we might expect to see that, if they have higher damage or longer loan terms, which is how long they have to pay back the loan, they may be less likely to use the funds, because that's either a longer time in debt, or they have more damage and less assets to be able to pay it back. And that is kind of what we see here with the business results here. Businesses with more damage and longer loan terms were less likely to take loans. The loan amount was insignificant, which is a little bit of a, contradiction of that, but it may be because loan amount is quite correlated with the loan term, just how loans work. Larger businesses, retail businesses, manufacturing businesses, and businesses in more dense areas are more likely to take loans, and so maybe have a better ability to repay those loans. Businesses are more likely to take loans when the approval process takes longer. So that might either be just a factor of weeding out maybe some of the businesses that fail during the time, that 6 months that it takes to get the funding, or it's just that, the longer that the loan processing takes, maybe it's a more favorable loan because, they're able to review the documents. And then our home parallel. So what households use the loans as well. It's a little bit less clear with housing rather than businesses. And we're kind of relying on fewer variables based on just the data that we have. So I don't really have debt related information like I do for the businesses, like the loan term. And so here, all variables were insignificant except for the owner occupied variable. Damage was insignificant, surprisingly. So people were equally likely to take or not take the loan if they had severe or less severe damage. It could be that households are not as sensitive to debt as businesses are, because businesses, of course, are very profit motivated. Or maybe homes just are more stable and they have a lack of other options for a better way of saying it. So yeah, I'm still kind of working on this one and looking at this one, but yeah. And the owner occupied is significantly less likely than seasonal markets. And that could be because of just the fact that these rental properties do have a steady stream of income rather than owner occupied. And again, the owner occupied houses and the people living within them are weighing quite a few different factors rather than just these simple things that are included in here. Okay, and so does disaster assistance lead to recovery? So we can start looking at, oh shoot, my pictures didn't show up. All right, so this one's looking at whether or not the assistance led to homes being rebuilt or not. So this is just a, yes or no, the home rebuilding process started. And this is any time between Hurricane Ike and around 2017. So if there was ever a permit pulled for rebuilding a home, this is kind of looking at the factors that caused that. And so, a lot of kind of control variables in terms of, people that had, higher value homes were more likely to rebuild, or if they lived in more desirable areas, they're more likely to be rebuilt. But just kind of focusing on the finance piece, homes that received SBA loans were much more likely to start rebuilding. And that was both for the groups that actually ended up using the loans and having it dispersed, as well as those that had it approved. So both were a positive effect on whether or not they rebuilt their homes. And then this one's looking at timing. So if we look at how long it takes for someone to either start rebuilding their home and make improvements to their home, loans might actually make it go either way, right? So we know that it can take up to 6 months to receive loans. For homes, right, that was more around 4 or 5 months. But looking at whether receiving a loan made a difference in how quickly people started rebuilding, and again, controlling for some of these other factors, we do see that having the loan dispersed and just generally being approved for a loan caused people to start rebuilding, in this case, 8 days and 11 days sooner for both of those. So they were a little bit faster in recovering when receiving these federal recovery loans. And then this is just a little bit of method background for the next one. This is that matching that I was talking to you about. So this is different than the other ones where we're looking more at kind of these broad population in Galveston. So looking at all the homes and all the businesses in Galveston. This is that control group versus treatment group method here. So looking at, in this case, businesses, trying to find two very similar businesses to look at where one received a loan and one did not. And so comparing businesses based on their type, whether their sector, the amount of damage they had, their size, number of sales, structure, if they were a female-owned business or not, a home-based business or not, and then grouping those together. And so, if you're interested in statistics, so you would have to use a conditional logistic regression in this case. So rather than looking, like I said, broadly at that population, this type of analysis really is just looking between those two pairs. So, the treatment and the control. So just looking at all the individual differences between the pairs. And so for this, we're using that to look at whether loans impacted whether a business survived after 9 years. So that's kind of the recovery that we had for businesses here. So did loans affect whether a business was still open 9 years after Hurricane Ike? The answer was yes. Businesses that received a loan had odds of survival that were 2.5 times higher than almost an exact or very similar type of business that did not receive a loan. And businesses, interestingly, that moved, so that's kind of this right here, were actually 3.9 times higher than a similar business that remained in their original location. So businesses that moved, and this is actually moving out of their original location, ended up surviving better than businesses that did not move and similar businesses that did not move, which is interesting in terms of, how we're going to maintain income and services within our community too. If businesses are making more kind of market-based thinking and trying to survive more. And so the last question, right, on what makes assistance effective is, does it make us better prepared for the future? And so this last little piece I'm going to talk about, does the SBA loan program allow for adaptation? for homes and businesses that receive the funding. And so for this one, I did a very small survey recently, maybe like 2 years ago, right at the start of the pandemic. So actually the response rate was a little bit low, but it kind of provided some kind of preliminary information for maybe looking into this a little bit more. So I'll be interested to hear what you guys think. But here are some of the questions that I asked and how they responded. So I asked, so these are all homes and businesses that had received SBA loan funding after after Hurricane Ike in Galveston. So I asked, had they ever considered moving from their location? And so, you kind of would expect that if you're receiving assistance to replace basically your structure, and especially if you're taking on more debt, you might be a little bit less likely to move, even though, in Galveston, they've experienced several hurricanes. So Hurricane Harvey was even more recently than Hurricane Ike in 2017 that you guys may have heard of. But even among the assistance recipients across homes and businesses, 32% actually split equally between residents and businesses had considered permanently moving from their location, even after receiving the assistance. And then just asking more explicitly, did receiving disaster assistance affect your decision to stay or move from this location? For residents, it was more common to say yes. So 32% said yes, disaster assistance did affect my decision to stay. And that can be potentially problematic depending on how you think about it, because we know that these structures are vulnerable, especially if they didn't make any changes to either elevate the structure or harden the structure in case of a future hurricane. And so this is potentially just keeping people in risky areas. Businesses were less likely to say they wanted to stay. They're a little bit more mobile, maybe for a variety of reasons. And as we saw from the previous analysis, in some cases, it's actually beneficial for them to move. And so then I asked, all right, so what are some of the factors that influence that decision? So are businesses and households thinking about disaster risk when they think about where to live or if they need to move? And interestingly, so I asked them to rank these various factors. Disaster risk ended up being third in terms of how they were thinking about these location decisions. And then there were a lot of parallels between residents and businesses or homeowners and businesses. So there were definitely economic factors. So for residents, they were mostly interested in how close they were to their job, which makes sense. And for businesses, kind of the parallel, which is they want to be close to their customers and be able to serve customers. And then the second one was not economic, but rather more social, where residents really wanted to stay by family, whereas businesses had personal ties with the community and of course have their own families based on the workers and the owners of the business. So interesting parallels between the two. And then just kind of then thinking, all right, are they actually using the funding to elevate or make any additions to the home or business to be more resistant to a future event? SBA actually does allow you to increase the amount of the loan up to 20% of that initial loan to make mitigation improvements. But my feeling from talking to people in Galveston is that that's not very well known. And it's unclear whether, in this case, based on these survey responses, whether or not that was used. And so we're going to be doing some follow-up interviews. I saw Leah was on the call. I don't know if she still is, but Leah's going to be helping me doing some of these follow-up interviews to kind of see how these residents and businesses were making those decisions once they got the funding. Okay, and so sorry about all that. Let's talk about the interesting stuff, which is what does all this mean together? So thinking about, all right, so who gets the disaster assistance? It seemed like what we were seeing was approvals driven more by the quality than the damage of both households and businesses. And that was also supported by looking at just the amounts. So, larger businesses and corporations were approved for more, and that's controlling for damage. So you would expect larger businesses and corporations to need more money because they have more assets to be damaged. But even when controlling for damage, they were still approved for more. On the homeowner side, if the residence was of higher value, owner occupied, They were generally approved for more money, also controlling for damage. And then we did see those racial inequities among Hispanic block groups and percent non-Hispanic Black block groups that received generally lower loan amounts. And then disbursement decisions, whether or not they take the loan, that was a little bit more unclear for households. It was a little more clear for businesses. They do seem to make some decisions based on debt. They were less likely to accept a loan if they had more damage or if they had the longer loan term. Households damage was not significant, but of course, again, they may be weighing different factors, not quite captured in this model, and can explore that a little bit more. And so this question is really important because it leads in then directly to how we think about some of these recovery findings. So even though we see a lot of positives with who is with recovery, so of course, SBA is helping with recovery. So businesses were more likely to survive if they received a loan. Households that receive loans rebuilt were more likely to rebuild one and then rebuild faster. But when we think about what subset of our communities are actually receiving this benefit, you can start to think about how this might be exacerbating some of the recovery dichotomies that we see after disasters, where people with resources tend to benefit, people without resources or kind of more historically marginalized groups tend to do worse. And disaster assistance may play a role in making that better for those with resources and worse for those without resources. And so it's not necessarily improving that gap in some of the recovery outcomes that we see based on who we know is benefiting from assistance and what that assistance is actually doing. And then for the last one, businesses that moved were likely to survive. That could be good or bad. We're happy that, maybe there's some flexibility of either, well, in this case, businesses being able to leave riskier areas. But I need to do this for the homes as well to kind of see how the moving patterns looked in residences as well. But we do know, at least from the kind of quick survey that I presented at the end, that businesses and residents were pretty similar in their ranking of factors in terms of how they're thinking about their location decisions. So highest ranking was economic, second was personal, and third was actually disaster risk. And then receiving disaster assistance did affect the decision to move or stay, and we're interested to know why that is. So 32% of residences, 19% of businesses said that yes, disaster assistance kept them in that location. And then 27% of residences and 18% of businesses did use recovery funds to mitigate against a future disaster. And so I should have done that for this presentation, but kind of see the overlap too between the ones that said yes, that we used recovery funds to mitigate versus those that maybe were more or less likely to move. That would be interesting to look at, but I forgot to do that before this. Okay, so future research. Broadly, right, just continuing to think about how we can encourage building more safely, more equitably, and more sustainably through disaster assistance and how we allocate disaster assistance. So are we allowing for homes and businesses to make themselves more prepared for a future disaster? How are we encouraging more equity in how we're distributing loans and kind of reducing that maybe racial or income gap that we see in recovery due to these resource disparities? I want to also look more specifically at multifamily properties. So, they're pretty unique in that they blend kind of both these housing and business dynamics in certain ways. So seeing how those differ from these kind of more business and household based analyses. And then, of course, being in the construction management department, I'm really interested in how the construction sector deals with funding themselves, especially with more of these FEMA or public assistance type funding that they use to kind of rebuild and reconstruct. And then, getting a little bit deeper in some of these housing analyses. So maybe doing a similar matched analysis that I did with businesses with some of the households, adding this assistance to more longer term restoration recovery models. So, I just looked at the rebuilding decisions and how quick it was for them to get a permit to rebuild, but looking then more broadly at, how quickly were they able to restore their pre-hurricane property value, or how likely were they to stay in their homes, or do we see home sales a little bit higher with loan recipients? And then of course, always interested in local solutions. So how are local communities dealing with this? How are they supplementing or coming up with their own programs that are better than some of these federal programs, or at least having ways to make the federal programs filling that either equity or sustainability gap within our communities after this. So with that, thank you. Thank you for sitting through all of the statistical tables. So I look forward to talking to you, and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria Watson. Do we have any questions from the audience? Bill?
Yeah, Maria, I guess I had sort of two interrelated questions. Have you seen any response from SBA and/or FEMA to the research, and if so, what?
Yeah, so I was talking to, because SBA has their own kind of research employee that they synthesize research, and I was talking to her for a long time. She ended up moving positions. But they were really interested in the research, and I think they're very responsive to some of these findings. And I know, like, even with the pandemic, they were trying to change their programs, and I know they're listening to the fact that some of the pandemic programs were maybe having some racial inequalities with minority-owned businesses, for example. So I think they're always pretty open to research, and they're very open with the data. So yeah, definitely there's opportunity to share.
Well, I had a second question if nobody else wants to jump in. I am curious about the local solutions question, to the extent that there is leveraging in some fashion. From both angles, did the locals see advantages here that they can leverage? Are they putting more resources into related types of programs?
Yeah, I put that on there for a couple of reasons. One is I see Anna's on the call too, but I really loved working on the SHIP project. So Florida has these kind of localized offices, and so they often deal with some of the disaster assistance topics. And so if we see more local control over funding, do we see more equitable outcomes? And I'm just so excited about that work. So I put that on there because of that, to see if maybe we do see that with disaster assistance as well. So more local control rather than this higher federal control over where things go. Does that actually reduce some of these maybe, I don't know, differences that we see across businesses and households getting funds? And then, yeah, just generally, I'm thinking of a business example, and I know there's definitely home examples and household examples, but when the pandemic happened, there were so many local programs that emerged, at least for businesses, because this business assistance has been so inadequate for the last several years. When we think about the approval rate only being like 22%, and maybe 200 businesses out of 18,000 actually got funding. So I think communities are starting to kind of see these gaps that are happening and trying to think of how they can fill it. So like with the business ones, for example, like maybe having grants instead of loans for these like very damaged businesses or women-owned businesses or minority-owned businesses. And I wonder, if there's maybe some local, you would know more than me, Bill, about local housing solutions that have sort of kind of met the gap of either FEMA or the SBA assistance, but trying to increase the equity of these assistance programs.
Julie has a question. Julie Ma.
Hi, thanks, Maria. I apologize, I came in a bit late in the presentation, but I do have a question. And I know you said that you'd be looking more at sort of the residential moves and what they did with those loans. If you can maybe talk a bit more about that, and also when lower income groups did get, or households did get those loans, was it meant for them to rebuild their homes or to renovate, or was it to relocate?
Mhm. Yeah, so the kind of the, I'm not going to say problem, but I'll use it for lack of a better word. The problem with at least this SBA loan funding is that it is pretty tied directly to the structure itself. So it's really mostly just for rebuilding. And so I think this program in particular, I think excludes a lot of low-income residents because, you know, it doesn't really target renters as much, especially because, you know, it's really up to the property owner to make that decision rather than, you know, the residents within, if it's a multifamily structure or a residential structure. Yeah, so that's one problem is I don't see it really targeting low income that much, also because it's a loan. And yeah, in terms of the future stuff, looking at how they used the loans, yeah, we're trying to do some interviews in Galveston of people that have gotten this funding just to see, you know, what they did, because they do have some option. I think I mentioned that they can have 20% increase on their funding if they want to do either elevation or add in some sort of like reinforcement, like roof reinforcements or flood wall or something like that. But I'm just not sure. I'm not sure if they used it, and if people that are responding said that they did make, you know, future adjustments and how they manage that with such kind of strict requirements to the structure. So yeah, yeah, and then with the moving thing, yeah, I think, I don't know how, I'm still kind of thinking about it, but, you know, just looking at kind of the change in ownership using like the parcel and the tax data and some of the home sale data, and see if we do some of that like matching with like school districts and some of these other factors that we know impact people's decisions, whether or not people with loans are more or less likely to have sold their home, or if they, you know, maybe it's even I kind of have a suspicion that in some cases it's almost like a reinvestment development tool where people are like improving their home and then selling it. So yeah, that was a lot. Sorry, I hope that answers your question.
No, it does. Thanks.
So Hala has a question.
Thank you, Dr. Watson. I have a question about your future research. So you mentioned we need to looking for the relationship between the assistant and the construction sector. So would you please just open it a little more? What kind of look or aspect we have to take care of, and we have to look at it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe this is just my ignorance on the topic, but I just don't see a lot of engagement with the construction sector in disaster management in terms of, you know, this, you know, permitting, how quick we can get this permit process or rebuilding, or having more local companies, making sure we're having local procurement. But yeah, I think one of the big things though that I'm thinking about is how do we link all of this sustainability research that's going on in terms of materials and in terms of, you know, Bill, I know you mentioned green infrastructure. How do we start getting that type of advancement into how we're rebuilding, and how can we make it easier for people to start putting in more energy efficient, you know, parts of their house, or using more sustainable construction practices when rebuilding.
Oh, okay.
That's kind of what I was thinking of. Yeah.
So it means for the construction sector, do we need people come inside, or do you think, because one of the struggle I have always in my mind that the construction industry always just blocking coming people inside their design or in the process. So always I'm thinking when we are talking about the engaging people and or participatory researchers, how we can just bring them in a like a sector that's like has a positives always mind. So do you have any idea?
Not yet, but we can talk about it for sure.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. It's interesting because the construction sector is like, you know, we always talk about like winners and losers after disasters, and everyone always talks about construction as a winner.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and so, but you know, is that always the case, or is it like maybe you're saying that these kind of local construction companies or contractors are coming in from outside, and whereas maybe we could have more local solutions instead, or better prepare local construction organizations or contractors to do that work instead. Keep the money local. Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you.
I have sort of a follow-up question. When you dive in a little deeper into the household data, I'm wondering if there's a particular segment of homeowners that are really surfacing as being as getting funded, and then it would be interesting to tap into their overall levels of satisfaction with the process. So I'm thinking, for example, in length of residency, if there's a certain segment that have moved there and have been living there less than 5 years, they might feel like, okay, we're just going to cut our losses and leave, versus those that have a stronger tie to community or multi-generational households where it's just working really well for that particular configuration. And I don't know, do you have any hypotheses that you're wanting to sort of look at, or any conjectures about what that household data might look like more specifically?
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a great question, and kind of how I maybe was thinking about it too, but also, because there's sort of the social tie aspect of, living there longer, but also the longer you live there, at least in Galveston, in this example, you've been exposed to more hurricanes. And so I wonder if there's maybe some sort of, I don't know, breaking point. I don't know what the correct term is, but what is that turning point within that process that's sort of, I'm willing to leave my social ties, or leave my community, because I've just experienced too much loss with this hurricane. How that gets balanced. Yeah. Oh, you're muted. Oh, sorry.
Now, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But yeah, I think that sort of those tipping point questions would be, really, interesting. And then perhaps there's information in between all of these disasters that, workshops or heightened awareness as to making, your home more energy efficient, or processes to go through. The other thing I'm wondering is, was there anything unusual or non-normative about Ike that would need to be taken in consideration when you're trying to generalize these findings?
Yeah. That's a good question. I think Ike is not Ike, but Galveston is, at least, so on the business side, it's pretty diverse actually in terms of sector. It's not that tourist based. So I think the business findings are a little bit more transferable probably than the housing. The housing, is dealing with, those dual markets, the seasonal properties, all of the, rental vacation home properties. And so there's almost like a half and half of those seasonal properties, and then just the traditional, residents and the long-term residents. And so, I know it might be more transferable to Florida, because I know Florida has a lot of seasonal properties as well. But yeah, it might make a difference maybe in other coastal communities that have more long-term established residents rather than maybe the seasonal market. But yeah, it's a very interesting question, because yeah.
Great. Any other comments or questions? This has been a great lunch and learn to end our week. Well, if there are no other questions, I want to again thank you, Dr. Maria Watson, for sharing your really exciting research. And thank you for being part of this research seminar series.
Thank you guys. Thanks for all the good questions. Take care.
Thank you.